Showtime, baby. It's showtime. Time to get jacked. Time to get jacked. Let's go. What time is it? Showtime. Whoo! Golden Bloated back with another video just for you, the college football fans. So if you are a college football fan, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Look, it's a long off season, but I'm here to get you through it. We also have a great Patreon page. We're putting a lot of time and effort into that, and I call my Patreons the shot callers. I let them decide who I do previews and predictions on first. We also have a great website designed by Joey Foster and great writers led by head writer Michael Walker. Today I wanted to talk about the future of college football. In the past, I've talked about, doing away with divisions, and I've talked about the idea that the SEC has PODS, and I applied it to all the conferences, and I came out with something very interesting. Now, in order to have PODS, these conferences either need to have 16 members or 12 members. So I had to add some teams to the conferences that only had 14 members. It just wouldn't work with 14 members. Now the scheduling for the conferences with 16 members, they would have 4 pods with 4 teams in each pod. This would be for the Big Ten, the SEC, and the ACC. They'd have 3 out-of-conference games, so that's 3 games off the bat, then 3 games within their pods, rotating 1 home, 2 away, and 2 home, 1 away on a year-to-year basis. So that's up to 6 games. The other 6 games would be 2 games from each additional pod for a total of 6 more games, 1 home and 1 away for each pod, rotating on a year-to-year basis. That guarantees everybody plays everybody within 2 years, and it guarantees that everybody plays everybody at home within 4 years. Now the scheduling for the conferences with 12 members, they would have 3 pods with 4 members in each pod, aka the Pac-12 and the Big 12. And their conference names actually make sense in this scenario. Anyways, they would also have 3 out-of-conference games, and they would also have 3 in-pod games, rotating 1 home, 2 away, and 2 home, 1 away on a year-to-year basis. So that's a total of 6 games right there. The other 6 games would be 3 games from each of their other pod, because they only have 3 pods with 4 members, 1 home, 2 away for 1 pod, and 2 home and 1 away for the other pod, rotating on a year-to-year basis. Everybody plays everybody within 2 years, and everybody is guaranteed to play a home game with everybody within 4 years. I would also suggest that with these power conferences, in order for the scheduling to be even across the board, any out-of-conference games with group of 5 teams should be home games, and any out-of-conference games against other Power 5 opponents should be neutral site games. What that would do is that would guarantee that all teams rotate 4 road games one year, 5 road games the next year. The SEC tries to make sure that they schedule as few road games as possible. Go look at their schedules. A lot of their teams just have 4 true road games. Well, hey, if the SEC wants to do that, let's make it fair for everybody. And on this, everybody would rotate. All teams in the Power 5 would have a year where they have just 4 true road trips, and then in the other year, they have 5 true road trips. And look, I'm not picking on the SEC. I'm not debating that they're not the best conference in the nation. They are the best conference in the nation. But the way that they schedule their conference games, 4 home, 4 away, and they rarely schedule road out-of-conference games. So a lot of the times, they just end up with 4 true road trips. So let's make it an even playing field for true road trips for all the Power 5 conferences. And honestly, when I think about it, they're actually pretty stinking smart in how they schedule. The fewer amount of road trips, the less chances a team has to trip up. Now let's look at what these conferences would actually look like under the pod system. Remember, just because a team is in a certain pod and that pod looks really, really easy compared to the other pods, that doesn't necessarily matter because that's only 3 of their games for the entire season. They still have to play some teams from the other pods. But those 3 teams are the teams that they are guaranteed to play every year. So let's start with the SEC. I've already done a video on the pods for the SEC, and this is how I had it. For the South Division, I had Alabama, Auburn, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee. For the East Division, I had Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, and South Carolina. I kept those pods the same. For the West Division, I had LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Texas A&M. And then for the Midwest Division, I had Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, and Oklahoma. I am going to do a small change there. I'm switching Arkansas over to the West and Texas A&M over to the Midwest. So the new West looks like this: LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Arkansas. And the new Midwest looks like this: Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M. I think that makes a little bit more sense. I think the rivalries make more sense in that scenario. And I think it just looks better. I think the overall look looks better like that. So there's your SEC in the 4-pod division scenario. Now let's look at the other conferences. The next conference with 16 teams is going to be the ACC. Now right now they just have 14 teams. So I had to add 2 teams. And no, I am not adding West Virginia in this particular scenario. I'm keeping them in the Big 12. So the 2 teams that I think the ACC could add in this scenario would be Memphis. They have a pretty big fan base, a decent TV market. Facilities do need to be upgraded, but they're fairly decent, and they have a great backer in FedEx. The other team that I think the ACC could add that I haven't mentioned before is actually Liberty. I think Liberty is up and coming. I think the geography makes sense. I think they would fit quite nicely into the ACC. They've been doing very well in football, building their brand, renovating their stadium for football, and they've actually done pretty good in basketball as well. So here's how I would have the ACC adding Memphis and Liberty in the 4-pod scenario, each pod with 4 teams. In the North Division, I would have Syracuse, Boston College, Pitt, and Louisville. That's actually a decent pod, turned out nice. In the South pod, I would have Miami, Florida State, Clemson, and Georgia Tech. I also like that pod as well. Then I also have the Central pod, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Liberty, and Memphis. Maybe Memphis is sort of the odd man out because the other 3 teams are in Virginia, but that's the best that I can do. And that leaves us with the last pod. And this is kind of why Memphis ended up in the Central. I call this pod the Carolina pod. Why? All Carolina teams. You have North Carolina, NC State, Wake Forest, and Duke. I really like the name of that pod. I think it makes sense. The only thing that it does, it kind of puts Memphis in the odd man out in the Central, and that's okay. It's still doable. I like this setup for the ACC if they were to go to the pod system. For the last conference with 16 members, that would be the Big 10. Now right now they just have 14, so I had to add 2 members. The first member that I would think they would add, and it's kind of a no-brainer, and that would be Notre Dame. Notre Dame has scheduled the Big 10 in the past. I think Notre Dame would fit in perfectly with the Big 10, but who else could they bring in with Notre Dame? Well, they could bring in Navy. I mean, Notre Dame plays Navy every stinking year anyways. Navy probably has the strongest brand out of any military academy there is, so you're bringing in a good brand, and maybe the Big 10 could figure out how to make some money off that Navy-Army rival. I don't know, but I think that would make sense to bring in Navy with Notre Dame to make it 16 teams. How would the pods look, though? Well, for the East pod, this pod actually doesn't look that great. You have Navy, Rutgers, Maryland, and Penn State. Not a strong pod at all. But like I said in the beginning, that only guarantees 3 of your games every year. You're still going to have to play others from the other pods. Now, for the Central pod, this is a strong pod. Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and Indiana. In this scenario, Indiana, you're screwed. Sorry about your luck. But on the bright side, like I said earlier, only 3 of your games are guaranteed with Michigan State, Michigan, and Ohio State. You do have to play others from the other pods. Now, for the Northwest, we have Illinois, Purdue, Northwestern, and Notre Dame. Very, very close together. That pod is probably the closest in proximity as far as the universities go. Makes way too much sense. Now for the West pod, the last pod, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Also makes a lot of sense. I like this setup. I know the East is a little light and the Central is a little heavy, but the overall picture, it makes sense. And I really like it. Now on to the 2 conferences that only have 12 teams. First up, the Big 12. 3 pods, 4 teams each. In the East pod, we have West Virginia, Cincinnati, UCF, and Iowa State. That's the best that I could do because West Virginia and Cincinnati, they're off on an island. UCF, they're off on an island. And you got to lump in Iowa State because they're the most eastern part of the central part of the Big 12. Now for the West Division, we have Kansas, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and BYU. That's the most sense I can make out of the West part. Then there's the last pod, another state name, the Texas pod. Why is it the Texas pod? Well, it's because you have Houston, Baylor, TCU, and Texas Tech. So it makes sense just to call it the Texas pod. And I think this pod system works quite well for the Big 12. The hilarious thing about that is, right when Texas leaves the Big 12, the Big 12 would have come up with a pod named after the state of Texas. And we all know Texas fans, they're divas. They want all the attention. So instead of staying in the Big 12 and being in a division literally named after the university, after the state, Texas, they're over there in the SEC getting their butts whooped. I would call that the ultimate revenge if that were to happen. Finally, the Pac-12, the last conference we're going to talk about, and they also have 12 members. 3 pods with 4 teams each. In the North Division, we have Washington, Washington State, Oregon, Oregon State. Makes a lot of sense. I like it. In the South Division, this is a little weird, still makes sense though. Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado. I know Colorado's a little north to call them in a South Division, but if you look at all the teams, that's the only thing that really makes sense. And finally, the last pod. Yeah, another pod named after a state, the California pod. Why? Because you have Cal, Stanford, USC, UCLA, all California schools. It makes sense. So you'd have 3 conferences with state named pods. You'd have the ACC with the Carolina pod, you'd have the Big 12 with the Texas pod, and you'd have the Pac-12 with the California pod. Personally, I like it. Maybe it's not your cup of tea, but I really enjoy it. Y'all let me know what you think about this situation that I thought up in my head. Purely speculative, purely my opinion. And if you like it and you'd like to change some things, let me know in the comments. I'm definitely interested in your opinion on this one. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you on my next show.